251, Chapter 9, The Trusties. One of the first native concepts a newcomer coming to a camp learns is that of the trustee. That is what the natives rudely called everyone who managed not to share the common foredoomed lot, who either got out of general work or never ever got into it. There was no lack of trustees in the archipelago, limited in the living zone to a strict percentage of registration, Group B, and a work by staff tables that nonetheless always managed to surge over that percentage, partly because of the pressure from those desiring to save their skins, partly because of the ineptitude of the camp bosses, who were incapable of managing and administering with a small staff. According to 1933 statistics of the People's Commissariat of Justice, the personnel at places of detention, including economic managers and its true trustee guards, constituted 22% of the total number of natives. If we reduce this figure to 17 or 18%, taking out the trustee guards, this still amounts to 1/6. So it is already clear that we are speaking in this chapter of a very significant camp phenomenon, but the total percentage of the trustees was much higher than 1/6. After all, these were only the compound trustees, and in addition, there were all the work trustees. And then there were also a turnover among the trustees. And many more prisoners at one time or another during their camp career were apparently trustees for a time. And the main thing was that among those who survived, those released, the trustees constituted a very high proportion. I would say 9/10 of the long-termers from the 58th. Almost every long-term Zec you congratulate on having survived was a trustee, or had been one for a larger part of his term, because the camps were destructive, and this must not be forgotten. All classifications in this world lack sharp boundaries, and transitions are gradual, so it is here the edges are blurred. By and large, everyone who did not leave the camp compound during the working day could be considered a compound trustee. A worker in the camp workshops lived much more easily and better than the slogger on general work. He did not have to go out for the lineup, and this meant he could rise up and breakfast much later. He did not have to march under convoy to the work site and back. And there were fewer severities, less cold, less strength spent. Also, his workday ended earlier. Either his work was in a warm place and not in a brigade. In a warm place, or else a place to warm up was always handy. Sorry about that. And he usually worked not in a brigade, but as an individual craftsman, which meant he did not have to put up with the nagging from his comrades, but only from the chiefs. And since he was often enough engaged in making something on personal orders from those same chiefs, instead of being nagged at, he even got handouts, favors, and permissions to have first call on clothes and footwear. He had a good chance of eating something on orders from the Zecs too. To make things more clear, the corrective-labor was like a working part of the establishment of servants in the manner of a serf owner. If, within this category, a lathe operator, a carpenter, a stove maker was not yet full-fledged trustee. A shoemaker, however, and a tailor even more so, was already a high-class trustee. Tailor in the camp sounds and means something like an assistant professor out in freedom. And the reverse side is that in camp the genuine title assistant professor sounds derisive, and it is best not to call yourself that and become a laughing stock. The camp scale of the significance of professions is quite the reverse of the scale out in freedom. A laundress, a hospital attendant, a dishwasher, a stoker, bath workers, a cook's helper, simple bakers, and barracks orderlies were also trustees, but of a lower class. They had to work with their hands and sometimes hard. All, however, were well fed. The genuine compound trustees were cooks, bread cutters, store clerks, doctors, stock clerks, doctors, medical assistants, barbers, instructors of the cultural and educational section, bath managers, bakery managers, storeroom managers, parcel room managers, senior barracks orderlies, superintendents of quarters, work assigners, accountants, clerks of the headquarters, barracks, engineers of the camp compound, and of the camp workshops. Not only were they all well-fed, clad in clean clothes, and exempt from lifting heavy weights or from crooks in their back, but they had a great power over what was most needed by a human being, and consequently power over people. Sometimes they fought, group against group, conducted intrigues, overthrew each other or raised each other up, or quarreled over bribes. More often they lived in a state of joint mutual defense against the rabble, as a satisfied establishment which had no reason to divvy up things with others, since everything had long since been divvied up once and for all, and each had his own sphere. And the stronger this clique of compound trustees was, the more the camp chief depended on it, sparing himself worry. The fates of all arriving and sent off on prisoner transports, the fates of all the ordinary sloggers, were decided by these trustees. Because of the human race's customary narrow-minded attachment to caste, it very soon became inconvenient for trustees to sleep in the same barracks as ordinary sloggers, on the same multiple bunks, or even, for that matter, on any multiple bunk at all, or anywhere else except a bed, or to eat at the same table, to undress in the same bath, or to put on the same underwear in which the sloggers had sweated and which they had torn. And so the trustees set themselves apart in small rooms with 2, 4, or 8 persons in each, and ate their food of their choice, supplementing it illegally, discussed all camp appointments and business, including the fates of people and of brigades, without the risk of running into insults from the sloggers or brigadiers. They spent their leisure separately, and they had leisure, and they had their individual bed linen changed on a separate schedule. By virtue of the same caste foolishness, they tried to be distinctive from the camp masses, in clothing too, but these possibilities were not great. If in a particular camp black padded jackets or ordinary jackets predominated, they would try to get dark blue ones from the storeroom, and if dark blue ones predominated, they would put on black ones. In addition, they got the narrow camp breeches broadened into bell-bottoms in the tailor's shop through use of triangular inserts. Oops, sorry. That's good. The work trustee, properly speaking, consisted of engineers, Technicians, construction superintendents, foremen, heads of shops, planners, norm setters, and in addition, accountants, secretaries, typists. They differed from the compound trustees in that they had to go out to line up and were marched to work in a convoyed column, though sometimes they were not convoyed, but their situation on the site was privileged. They did not have to endure physical torments and were not utterly exhausted. On the contrary, the work, the feeding, the life of the sloggers was dependent in great degree on them. Even though less connected with the camp compound, they tried to defend their positions there too, and to receive a significant number of the same privileges as the compound trustees. Though they could never manage to catch up with them. But there were no precise boundaries here either. Also, in this category were designers, technologists, geodesists, motor mechanics, machinery maintenance personnel. They were by no means commanders of production. They did not share fatal power, and they had no responsibility for people's deaths, as long as these deaths were not caused by the technology of production selected or serviced by them. They were simply intelligent or even semi-educated sloggers. Like every Zek at work, they faked, deceived the chiefs, tried to drag out for a week what could be done in half a day. Customarily, they lived in camp almost like sloggers, who were often members of work brigades, and only in the work compound did they have it warm and peaceful. There alone in their offices and cabins were no free people about. They would drop the subject of government work and gossip about life, about prison terms, about the past and the future, and most of all, about rumors that the 58s, they themselves were most often recruited from the 58s, would soon be sent off to general work. And for this there was a profound, uniquely scientific foundation. After all, it was virtually impossible to correct socially hostile prisoners. So rooted were they in their class corruption. The majority could be corrected only by the grave. And even if, nonetheless, a certain minority was indeed capable of being corrected, then, of course, it could only be by labor, physical labor, heavy labor, replacing machines, the sort of labor which would have been degrading for a camp officer or jailer, but which nonetheless, once created the human being from the ape, and in camp, inexplicably transforms him back into an ape again. And that is why it is not at all out of vengeance, but only in the faint hope of correcting the 58s that it is strictly stated in the GULag regulations, and this regulation is continually being renewed, that persons condemned under Article 58 cannot occupy any privileged positions either in the camp compound or at work. The only prisoners able to occupy positions having to do with material values are ones out in freedom, have already distinguished themselves by stealing. Who out in freedom? And that is how it would have been, for after all, the camp chiefs hardly harbored any love for the 58th, but they did know that they were not even 1/5 as many specialists under all the other articles combined as under 58. The physicians and engineers were almost entirely 58s, and you'd not find better workers or more straightforwardly honest people even among the free employees. And so, in covert opposition to the one and only scientific theory, the employers began surreptitiously assigning 58s to trustee positions. Meanwhile, the most lucrative ones always remained in the hands of the non-political offenders, with whom the chiefs found it easier to make deals, and too much honesty would have even been a hindrance. So they used to put the 58s in trustee positions, but with each renewal of this regulation, and it kept being renewed, and before the arrival of any verification commission, and they kept arriving, a wave of the chief's right hand would send off the 58s to general work without hesitation or regrets. Temporary well-being painstakingly built up over months was shattered to bits in one fell day. But this expulsion was not so ruinous in itself as were the eternal rumors of its approach, which ground down and wore out the political trustees. These rumors poisoned the trustees' whole existence. Only the non-political offenders could enjoy their trustee situations serenely. However, the commission would come and go. The work would quietly fall apart again, and the engineers would once again be quietly hauled in to fill trustee positions, only to be driven out when the next commission was due. And other than the plain ordinary 58s, there were also those whose prison files had been branded with a separate curse from Moscow, to be used only on general work. Many of the Kolyma prisoners in 1938 carried this plan, and for them to get work as a laundress or a dryer of felt boots was an unattainable dream. How does the Communist Manifesto go? The bourgeoisie had stripped of its halo every occupation hitherto honored and looked upon and looked up to with reverent awe. A certain resemblance here. Quote, it has converted the physician, the lawyer, the priest, and the poet, the man of science, into its paid wage laborers, unquote. Well, at least they were paid, and at least they weren't left to work on their own in a field of professional specialization. And what if they had been sent out to general work, to logging, and unpaid and unfed? True physicians were sent out on general work only rarely. After all, they were called upon to cure the chief's families as well. But for lawyers, priests, poets, and men of science, they were only fit for doing general work. There was no place for them among the trustees. The brigadiers occupied a special position in the camp. In camp terms, they were not considered trustees. But you couldn't call them slaughters either. Therefore, the arguments advanced in this chapter apply to them as well. I'm going to take a break there. Thank you so much for listening. Have a good day or night.